call the September 8th, 2024 meeting of the Joint Committee on Government Organization to order. We do not have a quorum present. At this time, we'll move to our presentations. First presentation is by Dr. Edward Timmons, Director of the Knee Center. Doctor, if you would, identify yourself and your position for the record.
Yes, my name is Edward J. Timmons. I'm Director of the Knee Regulatory Research Center.
The floor is yours, sir.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you all for taking time out of your day. I know today is the first day of the first full slate of NFL games, and unfortunately, you guys have to sit and listen to me. So thank you very much for taking some time to listen to my presentation today. So I wanted to start first by giving a little bit of background about the Knee Center. I think the name can cause a little bit of confusion, completely understandable. Then I'm going to go ahead and move on to research on optometric scope of practice, and then talk about universal recognition, two topics that we at the Knee Center have spent some time digging into and understand reasonably well. So first off, let me just talk about the Knee Center. So we don't do orthopedics. I'm not that kind of doctor. I'm an economist. We're named after our benefactor, the Knee Family Foundation, and we've been around since 2016. We got started at a small liberal arts college in Pennsylvania. We soon after made the move to West Virginia University back in 2021, so this is our fourth full year at West Virginia University. Our mission is to produce high-quality research on the effects of government regulation and to communicate the results broadly to inform real-world change. We have a 12-member staff. It includes 6 econ PhDs, including myself, 1 history PhD, a wide network of affiliated researchers. We also work with students at WVU. We work with graduate students, undergraduate students. And what we focus on are a couple of things. We focus on labor regulation. So one of the topics that I do a lot of research on is occupational licensing, and I'll be talking a little bit about that today. We also do research on collateral consequences, so if folks have criminal backgrounds, how to make sure that they get reintegrated into society. We also do research on a number of health regulations. So certificate of need is one area that we do quite a bit of research on. We also do research on scope of practice, which is another topic that I'll be talking a little bit about today with optometrist regulations. We also are looking to move into new areas of regulatory policy. One area that we started digging into is child care regulation, but we're looking to grow, we're looking to provide more expertise. And I think one thing that makes us different and makes me a little different than most academics is I actually enjoy coming and talking to all of you. I don't just like doing academic research. I like making sure that the work that we do and also the work that our colleagues do is helpful to policymakers like all of you. We try to make our work accessible. We are able to provide testimony if it's helpful. We can also do short working papers, policy type of pieces that break down academic research and try to make sense of all the different moving parts. And we also provide commentary on policy issues. We don't take a particular side on legislation. What our role is to merely just take what we've come to understand from academic research and make the outcomes of those research studies more accessible. But that, in a nutshell, is what we do. And I'm not sure if questions will all be at the end, or if you want to ask questions during. Is there any protocol for that, Senator?
We didn't do it at the end.
Okay. All right. Very good.
If you have a breaking point that you would prefer to take questions, we're
Okay.
happy to accommodate.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. So I guess I'll just go ahead and dive in. And if it's okay, Senator, I might just take a pause after the first topic and then move on. Great. So the first topic that I wanted to talk about is eye care professional regulation. And this is an area that I think falls into that scope of practice area. What we're thinking about here is, what can folks that aren't physicians, so, folks that are nurse practitioners, for folks that are nurse midwives, physical therapists, optometrists, what are they permitted to do in the working environment that they're currently finding themselves in? And there are differences across states with respect to what these medical professionals are permitted to do. But I thought I'd take a step back when I talk about eye care, because there's a lot of terms, there's a lot of professions that are involved in this space. You have ophthalmologists. So ophthalmologists are medical doctors. So these are folks that have gone to medical school, they've completed residency, and they are experts on the eye. All right, these are folks that perform surgery and treat various eye conditions. Another important professional in this space is an optometrist. Optometrists are not medical doctors, but they have been specially trained in treating eye conditions. Much like medical doctors, optometrists, they'll complete their bachelor's degree. They'll then go to optometry school for another 4 years, and about a quarter of them complete residency. They have not received the same extensive training as medical doctors, nor can they perform all of the techniques, all of the various procedures that fully trained ophthalmologists can perform. However, they are highly trained medical professionals, and they do offer treatment. I'll give you an example. I have pretty high eye pressure in my eye, and I was diagnosed to potentially have pigmentary glaucoma. So I can get eye drops from my optometrist to get treatment for the high eye pressure, to make sure that my pressure is not too high. I can also get treatment from an ophthalmologist, right? Both of those professionals can offer me treatment for that specific procedure. Opticians are another provider in this space. Opticians are the folks that are assisting optometrists, potentially assisting ophthalmologists as well, with fitting lenses, helping you choose lenses. They might also assist with the various tests and procedures that you're receiving while you're visiting your eye doctor or your optometrist. A big issue that we're facing, and it's particularly acute in rural areas, is we just don't have enough ophthalmologists. There aren't enough physicians that are entering this very specialized field of ophthalmology. I pulled up an article here, and this is from a journal that's published by ophthalmologists, and it's just giving projections on what we're going to expect with respect to the number of ophthalmologists working nationwide. And you can see that there's a projection of a 12% decline. There just aren't as many people completing residencies in ophthalmology. More physicians are choosing other areas of specialization. But at the same time, you have more folks that need treatment for various eye ailments. So it's a classic problem. I'm an economist. I like to think about things in terms of supply and demand. You have declining supply of ophthalmologists. You have fewer folks that are entering this market. And at the same time, you have growing demand for this very, very specialized service. So how can we address this, right? We'd love to just have as many ophthalmologists that we need, but we face this shortfall. We just don't have enough ophthalmologists in order to meet demand for specialized eye care. So one potential solution, and it's a solution that actually has been tested in the past and used and deployed here in West Virginia, is turning to optometrists. And these are just some statistics that I pulled up. If you need more detailed statistics, I mean, it's what we love to do. We'd be happy to pull them up for you. But what I have here are just counts of the number of optometrists in West Virginia and the number of ophthalmologists. So there's many more optometrists in West Virginia than there are ophthalmologists. And much like every other state, the number of ophthalmologists in West Virginia is projected to decline. There's going to be more retirements, and there's just not as many folks entering the market. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some research that I did, and then talk about the area of laser therapy, which is an area that is expanding across the country within the last several years. So historically, we have seen a really big shift with respect to what optometrists are able to do and what they're able to provide to patients. A number of decades ago, optometrists were really just eye examiners. They weren't all that much different from opticians. They were checking your eyesight, they were prescribing contact lenses and so forth. But I think recognizing this shift ahead of time and recognizing that this is likely to be a problem in the future, we saw big differences occur with respect to what optometrists are able to do. And I have to give West Virginia credit. West Virginia was actually the first state in the country to allow optometrists to prescribe what are called therapeutic pharmaceutical agents. So this could be, for example, eye drops for glaucoma. Back in 1976, West Virginia was the first state in the country to allow optometrists this authority. And this map kind of breaks down how this evolved. Now every state allows it. But West Virginia was really a leader. West Virginia was the first state to grant optometrists this authority. So what? You know, why is this a big deal? Well, we analyze the effects of optometrists getting this ability to treat patients for a glaucoma. And what we estimated is that by granting optometrists this permission, by allowing optometrists to provide treatment to patients for glaucoma, we observed a 12% reduction in vision impairment nationwide. So, and it makes good intuitive sense to us. If you give patients the opportunity to be able to get treatment from other providers, they're likely to get that treatment. And interestingly, there seem to be bigger reductions for minority groups. All right, so perhaps these patients were better able to access optometrist care rather than ophthalmologist care. So that's what we observed looking at some of the historical changes, right? Looking at optometrists being able to now treat patients for glaucoma. What we've been beginning to see across the country is optometrists having more authority, and specifically looking at the use of laser procedures. So this is just a map of the United States, and all of the states in green have now allowed optometrists the authority to provide laser procedures. So we're talking about treatment of cataracts. We're also talking about using a laser to treat glaucoma. Right? I've never lived in a state where an optometrist could do this. Right? If I wanted to get treatment for my eye pressure and I wanted to get a laser procedure done, I would have had to go to an ophthalmologist. Right? I've lived in Pennsylvania, I've lived in Ohio, I've lived in West Virginia. I haven't traveled a whole lot outside of Appalachia. Right? But my only choice would have been to go to an ophthalmologist to get a laser procedure done. If I was working with an optometrist, I would have had to go the drop route. Right? Whereas all of the patients in the states in green, they can potentially go to an optometrist to get that treatment. Right? Potentially helping to save their sight, or helping them just with their everyday lives. Now, this is relatively new, but there have been a couple of studies that have come out, and it's something that we at the Knee Center plan to dive into as well, and we're already working on trying to better understand this question. But here's what we know to this point. There is one study that just came out a couple of months ago, and it looks at all of the laser procedures that have been done by optometrists in the states that allow them, and also in countries that allow them, because there are other countries that also currently allow optometrists to perform laser procedures, like New Zealand, for example. And they were only able to find 2 negative outcomes. So at least in this study, and it's not, I would say, comprehensive. It's not, a complete picture. But what I will say is that of these procedures that were looked at, only 2 of them found any evidence of complaints. Only 2 of them were documented as a negative procedure in this comprehensive study. There was one other study that I came across. This was an older study, and it was only focused on Oklahoma. Oklahoma was the first state that allowed optometrists to perform laser procedures. And what they found is that there was some evidence that if optometrists were performing the procedure, there was more evidence of a repeat procedure. But what I will say is that this was older data. This was focused on the first state. And this other study that's looking at more new data doesn't find evidence of any sort of complications or any consequences from optometrists receiving this authority. So optometrists now are actively being taught how to do laser procedures in every state. And optometrists ultimately, if they were granted this authority, would have to complete additional postgraduate training. But certainly it would seem, just based off of the evidence that we have up to this point, that optometrists are capable of performing this procedure. Technology has evolved. I think optometrists have gotten better at performing laser procedures. And everything that I've read up to this point suggests to me, and also looking historically at the impact that giving optometrists this broader authority has had, it would seem that the benefits of granting optometrists this authority outweigh the costs. So let me just pause there. That's the end of my comments specifically on this topic, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
You have questions of the presenter?
Thank you for being here today and for your presentation. We've heard testimony along these lines.
You turn that mic around and see that it's on.
Thank you. We've heard testimony on this in the past and how it's impacting students, particularly when they're graduating. We're having a hard time retaining optometry students in the state of West Virginia. They're leaving because they can practice elsewhere. But there seems to be a bottleneck when we start this discussion with physicians. Where is that heading? Is there more reception to this idea at this point, or how is it being received?
Yeah, I think these conversations are also always very delicate, and I think I'll use an analogy. I mean, I'm thinking of myself. I had to complete a lot of math. I had to do a lot of things to be able to do statistical analysis and a lot of the things that I do as a PhD trained economist. But technology has evolved. It is a lot easier nowadays, I think, for folks to get to be able to do statistical analysis. There's AI, so it's become a lot easier, I think, for folks to be able to do the job that I do. But I'm always hesitant. I'm like, well, I had to go through this, so they should have to go through it too, if they're going to be able to do the job that I do. And I think it's similar with physicians. I think that there can be some natural human tendency to be resistant to folks that have not completed exactly the same training as me to do a lot of the things that I do. Not everything that I can do, but a lot of the things that I can do. So I think what a lot of the time happens is there is this natural human tendency to want everybody to do exactly the same, follow exactly the same pathway that I have in order to be able to treat patients. So, I mean, I would anticipate that you're still likely to get some hesitancy from physicians. I don't really think in this particular case it's like purely a competition story. It's physicians worried, ophthalmologists worried about optometrists taking their business, because ophthalmologists have tons of business. There's a shortage of them. They don't have any problem treating patients. I think a lot of it simply boils down to I went to medical school, I completed residency, I went through all this stuff. I don't think folks that haven't followed the same path as I should be able to do some of the things that I can do.
But specifically with this, we're talking about being able to treat glaucoma with lasers, and that is being taught in school to optometrists, correct?
That's correct. That's correct. So, I mean, you will hear a lot of arguments that, this is not something they were trained to do, or this is outside of their scope. But optometrists are now receiving this training. And it's happening in 12 states already. And all of the evidence that I've seen suggests that there's not any negative repercussions from granting this authority.
Thank you.
If we expand optometrists' practice area, would that pass savings down to the consumers who are getting these services?
It's likely. I mean, I have not seen anything specifically in this vein for eye care. But what I will say is that analysis that's been done on, say, and we already have this in West Virginia, but allowing nurse practitioners more authority to work independently. There has been research that suggests that doing that does in fact reduce healthcare costs for patients. So I would suspect that it's likely to have a similar effect if we do so for optometrists.
Thank you.
Other questions? Doctor, I have a question here. We've got two studies. So the initial one shows only 2 negative outcomes in the newer study. The older one, you were having to come back and redo procedures. So is that same metric on the older study being used on the first one on the number of procedures that have to be readdressed?
No, they are. That's an excellent question. Thank you. They are different metrics. The newer study, the top study, is looking at complaints. So it's a different measure of a negative outcome. The older study that's focused specifically on Oklahoma is looking at those patients that had to go back for a second procedure. And there was some evidence early on in Oklahoma, and it could very well be that the providers at that time were not as well versed. Oklahoma was in many sense the lab where these optometrists were granted the authority. That optometrists did have, if patients were receiving the procedure from an optometrist, it was more likely they were going to have to receive a repeat procedure.
And other questions on educational standards. Are these direct comparisons? So are we looking at the specific level of education from side to side, and then perhaps residency and that type thing that went with that? Can you elaborate a little more?
Yeah, no, absolutely. The education that, and I hope I didn't imply this, but the education that optometrists and ophthalmologists receive is different. It is quite different. Ophthalmologists, they complete bachelor's degrees, they go to medical school, and they get broad education, right? And pending, if they decide to go into ophthalmology, then they're going to get some very specific training on eyes, but they get broad medical training, like all other physicians do. Optometrists, on the other hand, they're receiving 4 years of specific training on eye care. So their training in optometry school is different from what medical doctors receive. And the residencies are also different. Residencies for physicians are required. Residencies for optometrists are optional. About a quarter of optometrists complete residency. And I would never make the claim that optometrists are exactly the same as ophthalmologists. I hope I didn't imply that.
So when it comes to, a lot of this spins around laser, use of lasers and some current technology. So the ability to identify whatever the ailment is there of the eye, the ability to be able to identify that correctly before the procedure is done. So how does that stack up?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Certainly, ophthalmologists are better generally at diagnosing ailments. But in the areas that optometrists are granted the ability to perform laser procedures, and they don't have the same broad authority in any state, relative to ophthalmologists. But in the areas where they are providing treatment, optometrists appear to be competent to diagnose. And optometrists have been diagnosing glaucoma for a number of decades, as one example. Going back to the 1970s, optometrists have been able to very well diagnose something like glaucoma. Now, I think much like anything else, there are always going to be cases. I think, generally speaking, medical providers are conservative. They're all liable. I mean, if they do something potentially wrong, they can face consequences in court. I think, generally speaking, medical providers tend to fall on the conservative side. And if they find something that they're just not sure, they will tend to refer to physicians. I think, generally speaking, that's been my experience looking at how this plays out.
And on states that are currently licensing, do they require the residency as part of that licensing?
They do not, but they do require them, if they are going to get that authority, to complete that additional graduate training.
Thank you, sir. Other questions? Seeing none, Doctor, feel free to continue.
All right, thank you very much. So let me now turn to my next topic, and admittedly, this is a topic that I really love talking about. Maybe you could already tell that I love talking about the optometrist a whole lot, but I really love talking about this topic. This is a topic that I've been studying since I got started in academia, and this is the topic of occupational licensing. So I'll take a step back. When we use the term occupational licensing, we're talking about workers that, in order to begin starting to work, they need to meet minimum entry requirements that are set by the state. So we could be talking, for example, about lawyers, right? Lawyers are licensed in every single state in the country. If I want to practice law, I got to go to law school, I got to pass the bar exam. Medical doctors, optometrists, licensed in every single state. But barbers are also licensed in every single state, as are cosmetologists. Massage therapists are licensed in most states. Foresters in training are licensed in West Virginia. There's significant variety across states with respect to licensing requirements. And even though the job is very similar, licensing requirements can vary from state to state. One profession that this is particularly acute in is in, you wouldn't know this from looking at this haircut. My haircut's not the greatest, but I've studied the regulation of hair care quite a bit. I know barber licensing, I know cosmetology licensing pretty well. And there's big differences across states. In New York State, if I want to become a barber and begin working, I can begin working after completing a little under 300 hours of education and training. However, if I want to be a barber in Nebraska, I got to complete 1,800 hours. Right? So there's pretty big differences. If I remember correctly, and I'm hoping I'm stating this right, that barbers have to complete 1,200 hours. But don't quote me on that. I should double check that one. There's pretty big differences across states with respect to licensing requirements. And it's a big fraction of the workforce. In West Virginia, we have the 8th highest fraction of workers that need a license in order to begin working. I did a study just earlier this year that stacked up states in terms of the number of occupations that they license. West Virginia came in as the 33rd highest. We looked at 284 occupations, and we found that West Virginia licensed 173 of those. And just to give a sense of the variation here, Texas actually licenses more occupations than any other state. Texas licenses 199. Kansas licenses 136. So, big deal. Why is this something that we should care about? Well, occupational licensing can impose costs. There can be benefits from occupational licensing, but there's also costs. If you make it harder for an individual worker to begin working, again, I'm sorry, I'm an economist, I'm going to use economic terms here, but you're reducing supply. You're making it harder for individuals to begin working, so you're restricting the number of workers in that particular profession. And if supply goes down, we might expect higher prices. And in fact, economists have measured this. We think that occupational licensing raises prices for consumers. Occupational licensing also reduces employment. If you make it harder for individual workers to begin working, fewer workers will be able to take advantage of entering that field, to enter that opportunity. And unfortunately, besides some historical work, looking at our early medical licensing, early midwife licensing, we don't have a lot of evidence that licensing improves quality. And oftentimes that's what we're told licensing is supposed to do. We're told that occupational licensing is meant to protect us as consumers, to make sure that we're receiving good quality service. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of evidence that licensing is fulfilling that task. One of the best studies that I've seen done on occupational licensing actually came from the Obama White House. It came out in 2015, and it summarizes everything that we know up to this point on occupational licensing. Now, I don't want to get too much into politics. I'm an economist, but there's not a lot of things, right, that the Obama administration, that the Trump administration, that the Biden administration, and we'll see what happens, but Vice President Harris has also said that occupational licensing is in need of reform. Right? All of those, either candidates or prior presidents, agree that this is an issue that's worthy of attention. All right? Now, all of that being said, that's actually not what I'm here to talk about. The main thing that I'm here to talk about is the rigidity that occupational licensing creates when people move from state to state. When I moved from Pennsylvania to West Virginia, the authorities in West Virginia trusted the authorities in Pennsylvania that my driver's license was valid, and I was able to immediately continue driving. Now, eventually, I did have to go to the DMV, and I now am a proud owner of a West Virginia driver's license. But there weren't the same sort of delays, there weren't the same sort of frictions that licensed professionals face whenever they move from state to state. So if I'm a licensed CPA, or I'm a licensed physician, or I'm a licensed barber, and I did the same move that I did, I potentially might not be able to work at all for a period of time until my license transfers. I could work, and I imagine some of the professionals work, but they're not working legally, right? They're working on the side, they're working in the shadow economy, right? Not legally providing services. So this is a big friction with respect to occupational licensing. And whatever you think about occupational licensing, I think this is the one where it's hardest to justify. You know, why is it that when a barber moves from Pennsylvania to West Virginia, that suddenly they aren't able to practice anymore, right? That they need to go through a procedure in order to continue working. And we have some evidence that this friction is actually dissuading people from moving. There was a very well done study that came out about 4 years ago, and it found that tough provisions that make it harder for a worker, a licensed barber, a licensed electrician, to move from one state to another reduce their mobility, all right, by about 7%. So this seems to be a real problem. So we at the Knee Center have looked at this a lot. I mean, this is something that we have studied extensively. And I can say that as of today, a reform that gets at this issue, and I think gets at this issue very well, something called universal recognition, has been implemented in 26 states. Universal recognition, is a little bit different than maybe some other reforms that you've had some experience with. What universal recognition does is it trusts other licensing authorities. So it will say that, all right, if you're a licensed barber in Pennsylvania or a licensed worker, licensed worker period, lawyers typically are not covered. They're quite different, right? But most licensed workers, and your license is in good standing, right? So you don't have a background of cheating people. You don't have a background of all kinds of complaints against you. Your license is in jeopardy. That will accept your license, and it's as simple as that, right? That's how this reform works. And a little bit later, I'll compare and contrast some of the other reforms that try to get at this specific issue. So these are the states as of right now, and we have a study that looks at this issue, and we've been tracking this issue for a number of years now. These are the 26 states that have passed some type of reform. All of the states in green, they simply say that if you have a license in good standing, we'll accept your license. And there's some variety with the occupations that are covered, and there's some other specific differences as well. And if you have questions about those, I'm happy to dive in. The states in yellow, they require that the license be substantially similar. And I would argue that that is not going to be as effective. I mean, that's very similar to a lot of what is already in place for a number of professions, right? And I think what's critical is not so much, when I look at it, it's not so much the inputs, it's the output, right? If a professional is able to provide high quality service and they have a record, a track record, a reputation, then it's not necessarily clear that those different inputs are making a difference, if that makes sense. So, maybe Pennsylvania requires another 100 hours for a specific profession, or maybe they require 100 less, right? But if the consumers are receiving good quality service and there's no evidence of harm against them, then why focus on the input part of it? So what do we know about universal recognition? As I've said, we've looked at this a lot. My colleagues, Darwin Dale and Alicia Plemons, they looked at states that passed universal recognition, and they found that states that pass this reform, the border counties, get about 11 tax filers coming into the state. And they estimate that was associated with about $1.7 million annually for specifically the border counties. So this isn't a statewide estimate. I mean, we could aggregate this for all the border counties, but a pretty significant inflow. I did a study with my colleague, Dr. Kiwan Bae, And we also estimated the effects of universal recognition. And what we found is that states that pass this reform get about a 1 percentage point bump in the employment ratio. So more folks are working after this reform gets passed. Why are more folks working? Well, first off, you're getting new residents, right? I showed earlier that study that said that if you make it hard for licensed workers to move from state to state, they're less likely to move. Well, we find that universal recognition increases in migration for those licensed workers. And it's pretty significant. It's about a 48% increase. Migration's not that big. We're not talking about a huge number of workers here, but percentage-wise, it's a pretty big jump in migration. And we're also finding that more folks are able to find work. So you could very well have trailing spouses that they follow their spouse, they're licensed, but their license doesn't transfer, so they're not sure what to do. They're not necessarily engaged in the labor market during that period of time. Maybe they're working at a job that doesn't match their skill set, they're underemployed, or maybe they're out of the labor force entirely. Well, we find that once this reform gets passed, unemployment comes down for a lot of those licensed workers, and labor force participation comes up. So we think that a lot of those folks that were facing that friction, that long delay, if they were following their spouse to a new state, their license didn't transfer, that those folks are better able to get into the labor market. And we also find that this effect is larger in states that don't have the substantially similar language. So just going back quickly here, we didn't find as big of an effect, for example, in New Jersey. Right? New Jersey was actually the first state to pass this reform back in 2015. Their language has a substantially similar provision, and we weren't able to observe the same size of an increase in labor force participation and reduction in unemployment as the states in the green. So we seem to be finding that universal recognition has these important positive effects on workers and also in terms of economic activity. All right, it seems to be reducing a very important friction that workers face when they move from state to state. So I thought it makes sense to talk a little bit about the various reforms that have been put forth to try to address this friction, right? This inability of licensed workers to move from one state to another. Recognition, which is the reform that we've studied the most and the reform that I've spent some time talking about, it covers a lot of occupations at once, right? Oftentimes large groups of occupations. And it's not an agreement between two states or a group of states. It's simply West Virginia or whatever state we're talking about saying that we're going to accept other states' licenses. So it's a unilateral action by a single state. Compacts, on the other hand, and I know a number of compacts have advanced in West Virginia or perhaps are currently being considered. Compacts are one occupation at a time. And compacts are multilateral. So they oftentimes don't take effect until X amount of states have passed it. Right? You have to wait for a bunch of other states to act on it. And the research that's been done on compacts is much more mixed. There are some studies, probably the compact that's been around the longest is the Nurse Licensure Compact. That's been the most heavily studied. There is some evidence that the Nurse Licensure Compact increases mobility, but there's also some evidence that it doesn't have a lot of evidence on, or it doesn't have a lot of effect on mobility from state to state. So compacts, I think, can be a tough approach because, number one, you're going at it one occupation at a time, and then number two, you have to wait for other states. You're basically beholden to other states to act in order for the compact to take effect and work as it's intended. Reciprocity and endorsement are the two tools that are used right now. Right? Reciprocity, a state can enter into an agreement with another state or maybe a couple of other states, and they'll say that if you take our license, we'll take yours. So there has to be the two parties. It's a bilateral agreement. And up to this point, reciprocity is not all that universal. It varies a lot from profession to profession. But that's kind of the status quo. Another option is endorsement, and this would be a state simply deciding that they're going to accept another state. But as endorsement currently works, generally there's some sort of review that the licensing board has to do. So they have to take a look at the experience and the education of the licensed professional. It can be subject to delays to make sure that that license is in fact substantially similar. These states that have passed, that are in the yellow, essentially they're just doing endorsement for several occupations. The states in the green are the ones that are really being innovative, and those are the states where we seem to be estimating these effects in terms of labor market participation and employment. And then I'll close by talking a little bit specifically about West Virginia. Back in 2022, House Bill 4634 did become law. And the language of that law is quite similar to what we see for universal recognition reform. However, this reform was specifically applying to Chapter 21 professions, HVAC mainly, and Chapter 29 professions, electricians. So we do have something like this already in West Virginia. It's just that it's a limited set of professions. It's specifically electricians and HVAC. There's no coverage for where we see most licensed professions, which is Chapter 30. Right? So if we were going to move to universal recognition, then coverage for the professions in Chapter 30 would be where we find most of the licensed professions in this state. That concludes my comments, and I'm happy to answer any questions about this, or if you have any questions broadly about the Knee Center, or even if you have follow-up questions on optometrists, I'm happy to answer questions.
Questions for the presenter?
Yes, sir.
Thank you for your presentation. How would this have a positive impact, particularly the portability of licensing? Because we've seen, like, in our rural areas in West Virginia, you have, like, psychiatry deserts, you have even lawyer deserts, as hard as it is to believe. How would this have a positive impact on some of our rural areas within West Virginia?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And we have not specifically looked at rural areas, but certainly if you have new residents in a rural area and they have a trailing spouse, or maybe somebody is just looking to get out of the city and looking to move to a more rural area, they're going to find that this friction is preventing them from doing so. So they might be less inclined to just move in general. I mean, if somebody has a specific preference to move to a rural area, they might be disinclined to make that move because of this friction. So I would anticipate, and again, I don't have hard data, but I would anticipate that this would help ease some of that provider shortage. And in fact, looking at other professions specifically, like nurse practitioners, there is some evidence that enhancing their portability enhanced access to those specific providers.
Thank you. I have two really similar questions. So if somebody comes here from Kansas, for example, and they don't have a license that we require, I'm assuming it doesn't matter any of their history. They need full-out schooling to be able to be licensed. And on that same vein, if you're licensed in Pennsylvania and they require lesser hours, Do we accept any part of that? Do you have to go back and get your degree or training or whatever completely again? Like, how is that working right now?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And I mean, I can give you an example. The electricians, for example, electricians are not licensed in every single state. You have like county or city level licensing, but in the case of electricians in West Virginia right now, we do offer a pathway for unlicensed electricians to begin working. Now, we don't simply say, well, you know, I'm an electrician. Look, you know, I can do this kind of stuff. You have to have documented experience in order to be able to do so. And if I come back to this map, a number of the states that are in green here, with the reform that they passed, and this is one of the, I'll back up a little bit. This is one of the particular aspects of the reform that I didn't dive into. But some states offer pathways for unlicensed workers. So I mentioned massage therapists, for example. Massage therapists are not licensed in every single state. But they could very well be working and have a reputation and, you know, providing good quality service for decades in another state. And states like Iowa, Mississippi, Missouri, Nebraska as well, they offer pathways for those unlicensed workers. So even if I don't necessarily have that credential, maybe I have a credential from a private association, there is a pathway for those workers to begin working. But it doesn't have to be that way. I'm not going to tell you guys what to do, but there are, you can offer pathways for those folks that don't have the license. You can also keep it as, you know, you have to have a license in order for us to accept that credential.
But if I'm a cosmetologist in Pennsylvania
Yeah.
and say they require 1,500 hours
Yeah.
to get your license, and let's say West Virginia requires 1,800, do I, even if I have 5 years work experience, do I now have to go get those 300 extra hours just to meet the flat requirements for the licensing?
Yes, as it is right now, I will have to pass additional hurdles. It could very well be I need to complete 300 hours of education and training. But there will be additional experience or education that I have to document. And ultimately, a lot of the time, it's quite ad hoc. There's a substantially similar requirement that's embedded. Or it could very well be that, you know, we're not going to offer any sort of transfer. And you're going to have to potentially go through the whole process all over again. So this reform gets at that. So this reform would say that if in Pennsylvania that you've completed a little less education, but you have a good track record, that we'll accept your license. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Other questions? Doctor, I have another question. If we were to adopt universal recognition, how would that impact, in your view, existing compacts?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. What states oftentimes do is they will offer two pathways. So if there already is an existing compact, individuals can take advantage of that pathway if they so choose. But if a professional would like to take advantage of the universal recognition pathway, they will still have that opportunity as well. So in states that have recently passed this type of reform, what they will often do is they will specify in the reform that aspiring workers can either use the compact pathway or they can use the universal recognition pathway.
And working on an endorsement, something like that, would be similar?
That's right. That's right.
And just so everybody's clear, it would still require they would have to apply for and receive a West Virginia license before working.
Absolutely, yes. So it's not an automatic, they would still have to go through the application process. That's correct.
Any other questions? Seeing none, Doctor, thank you. And,
Thank you very much. Thanks for putting up with me. I appreciate it.
Is there any further business to come before the committee? Seeing none, look to the co-chair for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move we adjourn.
Questions on adjournment? All those in favor of adjournment say aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. We are adjourned.
Yeah, on the bar exam, no. I mean, generally with lawyers, they're excluded, just because the state law varies quite a bit from state to state.